Welcome, everyone, to the Before Christmas Security Magazine podcast. And I am joined today with Gavin, senior analyst from A2 in Asia as a specialty, and of course, Joe Frederick, who's been on the video podcast before, the managing editor of A2. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much for having us. Yes.
All right, so 2 show notes. So today is, of course, Mad Friday, which is the last Friday before the series of holidays that kick off here in the UK. So anything can happen. All of a sudden, we could be completely overrun with people. But the second part of this is to really set up the framework for our China special today, which we call Taming the Tiger. I think, to encapsulate sort of the discussion today, it really comes into 3 tiers, right? China, the opportunity, if you will, from a market perspective. China, the manufacturer from a goods in trade perspective. And of course, China, the threat that we're hearing a lot about these days. So Gavin, why don't we start with you, and you can tell us a little bit about the background and maybe give us some context. Is China become more aggressive, or is it sort of at the same level that it's always been?
No, China's changed a lot, and it's changed specifically under its current leader, President Xi Jinping. The reasons for that are complicated and as much psychological probably as they are economic or security based or any other factor. Xi Jinping is a product of the Cultural Revolution. He came from an elite background. His father was persecuted under Mao Zedong and the Red Guards. He was sent to the countryside. He spent years clearing out the pigs and stuff like that, like a lot of other young people of his own class and type. And he is now in power. And this is along with people who went through a similar experience. And it's very hard to understand modern China without understanding its immediate or sort of medium-term history and past. China itself will always go back either way back to its dynasties, to the Mings and the Tangs and all the rest of it, which were the glorious times of China, great civilization, which of course it is and was. It goes back to the foundation this year, the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, and it focuses on that. But the real thing that is changing and directing China is what happened really 30 years ago or so in the Cultural Revolution, 30, 40 years ago, 1966, 67, 68. And that's where we are. This is, it's like a sort of melting ice cube. And in the middle of it is this core of all sorts of complexities, resentment, fear, and revenge.
Let's dive into that, Joe, because I think, it's interesting. Given the background of the president of China, you would think he would be quite sensitive to some of the issues that have been tabled, such as the Uyghur population, as well as, now the diplomatic boycotts. I'm not really sure what a diplomatic boycott is of the upcoming Olympics in Beijing. It seems like there's been a number of things happen to embarrass China. And do you think that China is responding, or are they picking their battles? Are they maneuvering here, or are they like a punch-drunk fighter?
Yeah, I don't think they're a punch-drunk fighter at all. I think every move is calculated. I think it's calculated very well, basically, and it's aimed to kind of antagonize, to kind of push the envelope, if you will. I think Gavin hit upon a very good point about how the situation has been a kind of melting ice cube, and what's going to kind of emerge from that, or has emerged, is a lot of kind of anger, resentment, revenge. We see the same happening with Russia, right, which we kind of spoke about in an earlier podcast. And it's kind of what's driving a lot of this kind of foreign policy, defense and security policy. A lot of the kind of policies coming out of Beijing are aimed to kind of, one, advance its strategic interests, right, which also kind of spill over into kind of the security sphere as well. So, we've got issues that have arisen, such as the hypersonic testing of new kind of weapon systems.
Right.
We've got kind of an advancing kind of cyber warfare capabilities, cyber espionage capabilities, and all of this is calculated. All this is kind of has been anticipated as well. So I think what's really of interest is the speed as how these things have kind of emerged in recent years, I'd say, and I think that speed's only going to pick up and present more of a kind of, I guess, gives China leverage to kind of, again, advance its strategic interests, move into new markets, if you will. It'll be quite interesting to see what's going to happen over the next kind of 5 to 10 years with respect to that.
We'll zoom in a little bit because I think, there is this perception that, the PLA has never been bloodied in a conflict. So we see a lot of sort of maneuvering and capability being developed. Is it a bit of a paper tiger, or is there some teeth behind it? And I'll say this, nothing says I don't like you more than building a replica aircraft carrier of your country and putting it in the middle of the desert to practice to take pot shots at, right?
Well, just to take your last point first, that was, I don't know if that's a dark Chinese joke, but it is, it was obviously intended for US satellites to see. And if you do look at the imagery, it's on a railway track.
I saw that as well.
And what it doesn't show is how long is that railway track. I mean, does it go for hundreds of miles? And then they send this thing rumbling off into the middle of the Altai Desert or whatever it is? Or is it just there to say to the Americans specifically, we've made a copy of, out of plywood or whatever it is, of an aircraft carrier. The Americans won't be remotely fazed or impressed or anything. They will laugh at this. The American Navy phrase when they built the Chinese turned out their first aircraft carrier, which is a Russian, bought originally as a casino and parked in Macau, and was then turned into China's first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. They called it it was a BGT, I think, big grade target, and that was it. That was US Navy pilots. They weren't impressed. They've changed their tune for two reasons. One is the Chinese hard navy, that is, say, the actual physical navy. The Chinese can obviously build anything at pace and all the time, and do.
And they are.
And they are. They can build ships just like they build cities. And we'll come back to that. And they're with property, which is actually very similar to their navy in a way. They can build anything and do. The problem is with anything, as you suggested with the PLA, I would just say that the PLA have been bloodied. That was in their war with Vietnam.
Okay.
Where they were seriously bloodied. The Vietnamese destroyed them. The huge costs. And my sort of little analogy there is that an Estonian Lance Corporal has got more military experience than a Chinese general, almost any Chinese general, because Estonians are part of the NATO ISAF presence in Afghanistan. And so, there is that. But again, one should not underestimate or indeed compare perhaps with the analogy that was made in the 30s with Japan.
Right.
The US, had an almost racist view, as did the West. I mean, the British the same. That the Japanese just couldn't, the little Asian people who couldn't work all this complicated equipment, despite having beaten the Russians in 2000, in 1904, 05. But nevertheless, they couldn't operate big modern warships and aeroplanes and things like this. So one has to be very careful about their capacity or their capabilities. But nevertheless, the fact is that they haven't been tested. They haven't had their key sort of command, control, intelligence, all these combined things, which of course the West has been doing endlessly.
Yeah.
I mean, the British have invented aircraft carriers. They've had them for over 110 years, I think. And the Americans, of course, had, I think, at the end of the Pacific War, they had 7 or 8 fast carrier groups operating in the Pacific, with 4 or 5 carriers in each one.
Yeah.
So, that's the difference. They can make stuff, but can they man it?
And let's pivot now to the making part, which is really about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is part foreign policy, part business opportunity. Is it, a part of establishing military forces in other countries? Is that a tactic that we might see, similar to Russia's approach to diplomatic relations with the Ukraine?
Well, Russia's relations with the Ukraine are fundamentally different in the sense that the Russians actually never understood why Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian, gave it away in the first place. I mean, Kiev is called Russia for Russians. Moscow isn't. Moscow is like Beijing is for the Chinese. It's a Mongol outpost. Moscow was where the Tatars sort of settled. So it really is. It's in the Russian spirit, and indeed in the Chinese spirit. Beijing is not where their heart is. Their heart is really in the Yangtze Basin and around what is now the modern central China, Shanghai, and the big provinces in the south, Guangdong and so on. So both actually do follow that analogy of sort of places. But the difference is that the Chinese, quite rightly in their own terms, really, have said they've never gone outside of their own declared borders. Now, people would argue what those borders are. Tibet being an obvious one.
Yeah.
They're somewhat they're challenged, to say the least, claims in the South China Sea, which nobody accepts. Almost literally nobody can accept it. The UN certainly doesn't.
Well, and suddenly Ireland, right? Like that's the other thing.
Making islands, yeah. But then again, the Dutch have sort of made a great part of Holland. So
fair enough.
I admit it was sort of semi-attached to there. But it's people make things. Singapore is I mean, I went to Singapore first time in 1967, and in the interim, I think it's added something like 23 square kilometres since I left, or at least since I first arrived. So that goes on, but it's the actual claim and what it means in terms of its relationship to its neighbours, specifically its inner neighbours. So that would be Southeast Asia, the Stans, the places where it's really emphasising its infrastructure, building and things like railways. I mean, I think last Friday, a week today, they completed and formally opened a railway through Laos. It took them 5 years to build a 419 kilometre railway from the border of China to the border with Thailand. Half of it is tunnels and bridges.
Right.
And they did it in 5 years.
How long has HS2 been?
Well, I'm sort of hoping somebody else will bring that one up. So you can sort of
How much time do we
but
have?
exactly so.
Yeah.
Exactly so. I mean, it's just phenomenal. Their capacity to build for engineering, for infrastructure, for just, it's almost, it's I wouldn't say that's a silly term to use as obsession, but it's a thing they can do extraordinarily well. But then to what purpose? What they've managed to do with a railway to Laos, through Laos, is put Laos in massive debt and in their completely in their hands, which follows on with similar things they've done in Sri Lanka. They built a port and an airport there, which have not been used, but heaped massive debt on Sri Lanka. This then comes on to your other point about, are these military assets, are these strategic? Yes, I mean, Laos strategic, Sri Lanka, why? All it does is anger India, who they've already got issues with along their huge, extensive border with India. They built a similar port in Pakistan, Gwadar, in Baluchistan, which again is subject to, the Indians are deeply unhappy about that. What happens? I mean, in Pakistan,
Djibouti as well.
Djibouti,
there's actually a military presence.
Yes, it's true. It's a dock really there, but it's also exactly next to an American dock and a EU, basic NATO sort of dock there. So are these What are they? I mean, they're not military assets in the sense that they're remotely defendable in the event of a conflict. They just annoy people, and they do. And they maybe that's what they're intended to do with India specifically. With they think they've bracketed India with Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, and all that does is just make India spend more on defence, get into alliances with other countries.
So
on.
I'm going to turn to Joe here because I think you're starting to bring up some really interesting sort of tactics, and I want to talk about a strategic plan. Is there sort of an economic war going on then that China is fighting ostensibly against the West, but when you say, Djibouti being a good example of how there's a NATO presence, an American presence, and now a Chinese presence, it seems to me it's sort of like it's like you said, annoying, but you said there's a plan behind it. So I'm wondering, is this China taking swings at the West through proxies and through sort of closing that ring?
I think the irony is that because China is the world kind of global kind of manufacturing hub, right? And that's purely down to just costs, basically, and the availability of labor. Nike doesn't have to have its kind of products produced in China, does it? Nor does any
India,
other country.
Pakistan,
exactly.
Plenty of other.
So there are
countries.
kind of these push-pull factors, right?
Yeah.
So I think China's economic leverage would probably be reduced a bit if these kind of multinational companies started to kind of, diversify in the kind of supply chain, right? Which is what we've been hearing about over the past kind of couple of years since actually more than that, since Trump kind of waged this economic kind of warfare with China. And so there are a lot of kind of push-pull factors, basically. So I think what it boils down to is, the world needs China, right, as a kind of manufacturing hub. And at the same time, China is kind of extending its kind of reach, broadly throughout the globe through economics, basically, economic leverage, either kind of getting countries into greater debt or setting up kind of manufacturing bases or trade routes with those countries. In Iran, for example, they recently kind of signed this 25-year kind of cooperation agreement, right? So Beijing is going to pump in about $400 billion over the next 25 years. And the trade-off is that Beijing gets really cheap fuel, right? Which it'll need to kind of for these kind of manufacturing kind of electricity.
Which somehow manages to move around any sort of sanctions regime that the West might put in place.
Exactly, and it also it also tells Washington that we really don't care about your sanctions, right? So we're just going to keep plowing forward. With what we want to do, basically. I mean, I don't know if Gavin has anything kind of to add to that.
No, I would. Chinese likes bilaterals. It doesn't like having to deal, certainly with acquiring key commodities. It doesn't like having to go through the global trading system. It doesn't like have to buy iron ore at iron ore prices, the price of the day. So they've gone to West Africa, for example. They've spent a fortune on building railways, opening mines, having to build ports, and what protects them? And the only thing they have at the moment is making alliances with local leaders. And if we can see in West Africa at the moment, in Guinea and Mali and places, Mauritania, places where China has invested hugely, specifically in iron ore, and specifically to get around the Australian issue, in my mind, and to a certain extent Brazil, where its main source of iron ore comes from, is that they're completely in the hands of, going back to the Lance Corporal analogy, not a Latvian this time, but an upset, somebody from a military faction, from perhaps, shall we say, an ethnic or tribal group that has been marginalised by China choosing to support another lot, will simply unbolt the railway.
Right.
Yeah. And there goes $10 billion and literally $10 billion worth of investment in an iron ore mine in Guinea or Mali or Mauritania or wherever it happens to be, because they are following in many respects, with their railways and all this, a 19th century colonial imperial infrastructure policy. It's exactly what the British did. They built our railroads. Always, I mean, you look at the structure. They always went from a port inland. They didn't go. You didn't have any capillary railways. It didn't look like, around London where you can trains endlessly going in every direction. They went north, south, east, west. Excuse me, just straight to the mine,
Right.
or straight to the commodity specifically.
That they're looking for.
And that's what China is doing, and it is very old-fashioned. It is astonishingly old-fashioned. It's in its own way rather quaint, because it at one level you can say it's a sort of misreading of colonialism and imperialism as it happened to them, because that's exactly what happened. China is now built. 2 years ago I was on a high-speed train in China, which is the most remarkable thing. It was just 1,000 kilometres north of Hong Kong. It was where I was headed for. And this thing, it was like the Romans built it. I mean, nothing got in the way. I mean, it was just straight, and it just went. It was just spanned everything, or just drilled through everything, and it was a brilliant train, very comfortable, very efficient. And in the time I was in this part of central China, travelling around, there were these things being built everywhere, more viaducts going up, more tunnels being dug, everything, all over the place, roads, astonishing road systems, and everything. And it was, there it was, very impressive, but very expensive. And you will say, well, why? I mean, there is, if you like, the German model of the last century or the previous century of railways dominated European strategy. And is China doing that? Just using.
I think history is quite important here to kind of highlight. It seems as if like China is using history, the templates of what's happened in the past, to kind of help it formulate its kind of policies that advances its interests, whereas the West has a tendency to kind of forget, the things that happened in the past.
Point.
And Afghanistan is a very, very good example of that, right? So
Definitely. I think it's really interesting because, this is, I think, the big revelation of it was that, they have looked at Western colonialism and they have sort of put their own version on it. I would say China hasn't been as brutal as, the colonial efforts of the last 150 years or so of Western history. But at the same time, it seems like they're spreading further, faster, and quicker than at any other point, in history.
Well, in that sense, they haven't. They've made relations with other countries, but they haven't, apart from debt and things like this. So they're not seizing power. I mean, they will seize back what they think is what is theirs. Hong Kong being an obvious example.
Taiwan potentially,
and Taiwan as a target and as a constant, an endemic threat, and of course Western China with the Uyghurs, who are not obviously Han Chinese and therefore beyond the pale in that sense, as far as they're concerned. So they're getting that back, or they've got it, but they're imposing their colonial version of colonial authority on the Uyghurs in a pretty brutal way, as yesterday's, albeit unofficial, the verdict on the so-called Uyghur Committee,
Right.
which reported yesterday, just with an appalling litany of horrors and so forth. So yeah, they will, but they haven't taken territory beyond their declared borders
Yet.
Well, I don't see it. I don't see them doing it. I mean, I think this is where they have a major problem. I mean, this goes back to the West African iron ore and all the rest of it. Is that what are they going to do? Are they going to put Chinese Marines into Mali or into Mauritania to protect their railroads and their iron ore? I don't think so. We did, and colonial powers did, but I can't see China doing that. They will evacuate their
own.
excuse me, their engineers and their staff. You will see red-starred tailed military aircraft going from China and picking up Chinese, shall we say, the Solomon Islands, if that kicks off again specifically Chinese people were targeted there.
Yeah, I don't
and
think...
so forth. So,
yeah.
I mean, they will intervene at that level.
I think apart from a few exceptions, I think Beijing doesn't have any interest in kind of seizing territory. And it goes back to the kind of the history aspect of it, right? So whenever kind of colonial powers seize territory, it causes a lot of disruption, right? So then you got wars flaring up. So I think with the exception of maybe, obviously Taiwan, and then there's Hong Kong, obviously. I think those are the only exceptions, really. So,
well, it's, I guess, somewhat comforting, but and I think the West does look at China and tries to apply a Western sense of Christian values on China, which is obviously completely inappropriate.
Yeah.
Watching China, though, and seeing what is unfolding on the global scale, let's get into some predictions for next year or the few years over. What do we see going on? Because there does seem to be a war on tech. I mean, if you're a tech billionaire in China right now, it seems like the government's gonna come in and tell you that you're not.
Yeah,
I mean, that's more of a kind of power grab, isn't it?
So it's a war on money.
Yeah.
And power, and money is power. And tech too, yes, because I mean the reach of the big platforms, Alibaba and Tencent and so forth, is obviously a challenge to an authoritarian central party as the communists are, just as, shall we say, on a spiritual level, the Falun Gong are, and so is Christianity, the church. They have anything which challenges their power, authority, or serves as an alternative focus for attention and fealty.
So more internal clampdowns within China and other territories of interest, or?
I would say I think the key thing to recognize in China is, despite how it's perceived outside as being intrusive, assertive, aggressive, and so forth, all of those it is true, but the great struggle is domestic, and that is absolutely the key of what's going on with shall we say everything from the property market, the tech market, that is, say, the platforms specifically, that is, say, their reach, and the inter-elite struggle, which is utterly central to Chinese politics, as it is everywhere else. But they seem to they respond to it in a somewhat different way. Whenever a new president or leader of the Communist Party, to be more accurate, comes into power, the previous faction, and there are always factions, there is no unified Communist Party of China. It tends to center around regional power brokers, leaders. So Xi comes from I think a northern central faction. He ousted a Shanghai faction. There have been Guangdong faction, which they don't like they're terrified of Guangdong in the north and the centre because it's huge. It's 110 million people in Guangdong province alone, and that's what Hong Kong is attached to, and will be increasingly so. And the Delta, the Pearl Delta, which is their manufacturing base. So Guangdong it's got an economy the size of California, and it's an enormous sort of thing. But everything is about how you control the elite and who are your competitors. The people are not your competitors. They're easy to deal with through a combination of suppression and reward. Both.
Carrot and stick, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of kind of regulatory pressures or policies being kind of implemented in China to kind of clamp down on these tech companies, but it's also had an impact on foreign tech companies as well, just foreign companies. So, Tesla being the classic example of that. I think it was in March was when the Chinese military kind of banned the use or the kind of use of the Tesla vehicles on military bases, simply because of the kind of the technology, the sensors around those vehicles can capture images and data basically. And what kind of spun off from that were the CAC started imposing these kind of new regulations on data privacy, information privacy, and that had an impact on these foreign companies who have decided to kind of, set up their own data centers domestically within China, right, to kind of shell that in there, basically. And so, but again, it's all about kind of control of information, control of kind of these tech companies, and that's a good way to kind of maintain power, I'd say.
Awesome. Well, that's been our look at China as both the threat, the opportunity, and of course, the manufacturer of all the goods and services that we consume. I'd like to thank both of my gentlemen guests today for being on the video podcast.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, pleasure to be here.